Hello, this is Nick from No Magnolia, and I thought I'd share with you some techniques that I've developed for a recent piece that we did featuring a load of logos, which may be something that you may have encountered in your own work. Here it is. It's basically, well, this isn't it actually. This is the first version that we did, the first layout that we did. As you can see, there are lots and lots of logos to get on the screen. Barclaycard is the main sponsor here, and then there are loads of other ones that we want to kind of fit on. And you can see that, I mean, they just look a bit rubbish, really. They're sort of spread around the screen, and you know, they're not aligned, and they just all look a bit shabby. So I set about thinking, what could we do to make them look a bit more professional, and specifically things like having the same gap between each logo, given that the client was probably going to ask for some to be bigger or smaller, or whatever, or moving them around in different configurations, and with different ones to start with. Some of them you see here, like this one is really, really wide, proportional to its height. Some of them are square, like that one. This one actually wasn't part of it, but this is a rare logo which is taller than it is wide. So I thought I'd put that in just to sort of throw another spanner in the works. And they all look a bit sort of higgledy-piggledy, really. So the main problem is to get them spread out so that there's the same gap between each one, so that they look the same size on screen, and so that they can move them around really easily. So, how do we do that? Well, by using expressions. There are various things. Oh yeah, I was going to say, the align. You might be shouting at your screen at this stage. Why not just use align? Well, yeah, you can. So you've got these align options here. So you can vertically align them. That does the trick. But if you horizontally distribute, which is this one, you get weird gaps. This one, because it's so wide, the gap between this and the monopole logo here is quite small compared to the gap between these two or these two. So align doesn't really work because it actually just aligns the centres, and what it's done there, it's done exactly what it said it was going to do, but the centres are the same distance, but it ignores the actual width of each logo. Also, align is something you have to redo every time if you wanted to swap that with this, and then you sort of moving that down, and then you select this again, and you go align, and it's not still quite working the way we wanted it to. So first thing I did was I got my layers, and I thought I'm going to have to iterate between a number of layers here. We don't know how many layers we're going to have, and also there might be layers before the first layer that you want to treat, or after the last one, and you don't want to. You want to be able to ignore those. So first thing I've done is I've added two adjustment layers, one called Start and one called End. All will be revealed. Then on each layer, I have added not that one, a row slider. So this defines which row the layer is going to end up in, and that one is row 2, and so on down to row 4, I think. Yeah, there's a row 4 there. And this was the rough layout, so we kind of just we arrived at this. They gave us the order that they wanted. Well, they didn't want that. And so we laid them out like this. But we need the Barclaycard logo up here to be big, but also centered, and everything to be kind of vertically spaced equidistantly. So how do you do that? Right. The first thing to do is to sort out the positions. So let's make a expression here. Now I'm going to be typing in a whole load of variables here, and the first thing we need to know is which start layer and end layer we've got. And this came about because I have previously in the past kind of just put a null layer up there, and then added a slider expression to sort of say start layer, and then based things on the start layer so that you can offset it. So if you have 6 layers up here you don't want to treat, then that's fine. you can ignore them. But I knew that I had to end it as well, so actually this is probably a better way of doing it. So what you need to do is just pick your layer and then just put start.index and then end index equals the end dot index, and that will give us, in this case, it will give us an index of 3 for the start and 22 for the end. Then we need to know what row we're in. So let's bring that up, Shift E, and then we'll twirl that down, and then we go this row, TR, and then we'll just pick that. Now, with float sliders, like this one is, you can actually have a number which is not a round number in the slider. We don't want it to be anything but a whole number. So what we're going to do is we're going to enclose this in a math round expression, function rather, which is going to round it to 0 decimal places. So it's actually going to make it a whole number. And then we need 2 variables. WW is going to be the total width taken up by all the layers before this one on the row, and TW is the total width taken up by all the layers on this row, and I'll explain that later. Similarly, we want 2 more. N is the total number of layers, and WN is the number of layers on this row before the current layer, if that makes sense. And again, I'll come to that. CW is going to be one called the width of the comp. So we need to find out the width of this particular comp first, and what we're going to do is we're going to basically add up the width in pixels of each layer on this in a particular row. So if I stuff them all together like this, show you more clearly what we're doing. Oops. So if we imagine that we're sticking them all together in one long line like this, so you've done roughly, and then we are moving that to the end. So we're saying that the available width that we've got that isn't logos is this. So that's the comp width minus every single one of these widths. And then we're going to need something else as well. I've got a move layer here, which is kind of like a control null. And on that I've got a few variables that I've added. Start layer we actually don't need anymore. Ping, gone. We're going to have one called xgap, which is the actual gap between each logo, each pair of logos here, and that's going to be consistent. That's going to be the same gap. That's the whole kind of point of this, really. The same gap between each pair of logos. We're also going to come to a starting Y point, so that's where this logo in the first row is going to appear, and a Y gap, which is going to be just a line of centers gap. We're not going to actually work out. We could go into kind of real depth here, and we could go, okay, what's the tallest logo on this row, and then what's the tallest logo on that row, and then have the same gap between each one. And we're not going to, because that would look weird. If you had a really, really tall logo, like the EE logo, for example, if you moved that up there and made it like that, the rest of them, because this one's really tall, you might need to make it this size to make it look perceptually as big as the others. And then that would move the whole row down and look really, really weird. So we're not going to do that. We're just going to do a line of centers gap, which is going to be fairly easy to do. Also on the move layer are 2 other control effects, which I'll come to shortly when we talk about scales, but we'll leave those for now. So X gap, Y start and Y gap are all just linear. If we just go to control and we can expand that, they're just slider controls, so linear slider controls. Now what are we doing? We're doing this. So we've got the width of the comp, and we then need an X position, Basel X position, and then a GX, which is going to be the X gap. And we're going to get that from up here, which we haven't actually expanded yet. So let's do that. X gap. So let's pick that, and your X gap is 111 pixels. Right, now what we need to do is we need to iterate between the start and the end layer. So we need a for loop. I usually use I as a variable. I mean, use literally anything. So we need to start at the SI start index +1, because we don't actually want to do anything with this layer here. I is less than EI, which is the end one, and then just add 1 each time. Close that off. So then we're going to have a variable called L, which is this comp layer I. So that refers to whichever layer we're looking at the moment, and we're going to take the scale at the end of the layer. The reason for that is actually that these can scale in at the beginning. So the first iteration of this takes the scale into account, and the scale changed, so that basically shuffled all the layers around, which was a bit weird. So I'm going to do L scale value at time L out point, and then we're going to just take the 0 of that, which is the X, the width basically, because we're not interested in the height. Now we need to test whether this is this layer that we're looking at is on the same row, because we're actually iterating between start and end, which is all of the logos, and most of them won't be interesting to us, so most of them aren't on the same row. So we go if, and then we need to do this math round thing. Value 0 tr. So all this does is it tests if we've already got tr, which is our row slider for this particular layer that we're looking at, and if the same slider equals that value on the layer that we're iterating through, then it's on the same row as we are, which means that it needs to be taken into account. If the layer is before this layer, we need to add its width to the WW variable, because we want to find out the total, two things basically. We want to find out both the total width of logos that we've got, and we also want to find out where this one should be in that sort of X dimension. So we need to do another if. So if I, which is the layer that we're looking at, is less than the index of this layer, so this tells us, if we're in this block now, it tells us that it's on this row, and it's this one, it's before the current layer, so we add its width in pixels to the WW variable. So L width, now it's scaled probably, so we need to do SC, which you'll recall, you can see up here, is the actual scale, which is between 0 and 100 and beyond, of the layer that we're looking at, and then divide that by 100. So that will actually give us, say it's 500 pixels wide and it's 47%, so that will be 0.47 times 500 pixels. So that gives you an actual pixel width. And WN++, that just adds 1 to WN to come out of that block now. We're back in this one, which means that it's on the same row, but it's either this layer or it's after this layer. So the TW variable is the total width of all the layers on this row, and we just need to basically do exactly the same as we did just then, but again, and n++. Lovely. Now, by the time we get down here, we know the number of layers on this row, which is n, and their total width, which is tw, in pixels, as well as the width of layers before this one, ww, and how many there are, which is wn. Now, the number of x gaps, let's go back into our thing and show you. So let's say we've got 5 logos on a layer. The number of gaps is actually 4, because we only need them between pairs of logos, pairs of layers. So we're going to define a variable called gn, and that's n-1, because it's the number of logos on that layer, on that row, -1. And then we need the width of everything, which is the layers plus the gaps. What do we call that? Total width. So that's the total width of all the logos, which we've got from TW. And then gn, which is the number of gaps, times gx, which is how wide each gap is. So the border either side is the width of the comp minus this over 2. So that's how much space appears on either side of this row of logos. So then the x position of this layer is this border x, which is the distance between the left-hand side of the frame and the left-hand edge of the first logo, plus ww, which is all the logos so far, plus wn times gx, which is the number of gaps before this one times the width of each gap plus half this layer's width. If you're still with me, I applaud you. So we're going to define another one called SC, which we actually defined up there, I think, but it doesn't matter, does it? Yeah, we defined it and we threw it away. So we're now going to redefine that to it's layered scale value at time, and then this layer out point O, and that just finds out the actual scale value of this particular current layer at the end of its out point there, and then the x position, the actual x position that we want, is bx, which is the left-hand border, plus ww, which is all of the width of all of the layers before this one, plus wn times gx, which is all of the gaps before this one, plus and then we need this layer dot width times sc 100 over 2, and that basically gives you the pixel width of this layer, and then divides it by 2, because we actually want the position to be right in the middle of the logo. We're going to assume that all the logo anchor points are in the middle of each layer, and then so that's the actual x position we need, and then the y position is going to be much easier. So we're just going to do y start equals I haven't expanded it. So we're going to do y start equals that, and we're going to do y gap equals that, and the y position therefore is y start plus tr minus 1, so total number of rows, times y gap. And that should do it, and then all we need to do is just x comma y. Bang. So Barclaycard logo is now controlled here by y start, and it's the only one on this row. If we now copy and paste this position value, as if by magic, select all the other ones. There you go. And you can see that when you go back to our move layer here, and if you do Y start, that will move them all down. If you increase Y gap, that will move them all that way. And if you increase X gap, that increases the gap between each one. You can put that at 0 if you want to. And then they'll be butted right up against each other. But you probably don't want to. And interestingly enough, this also takes into account the scale. So if you want to scale up a logo, then the X gap between that and the next logo will still remain consistent. So that's very useful. Also, if you want to change a row, that's very easy to do. Bang. It takes the order that the layers actually are in. So, for example, with our Heineken logo here, if we wanted to put the Bulmers logo, for example, into row 2, we could do that. And if we wanted to move our Bulmers logo up, so we wanted to move it like that, then it will just automatically follow on. So it's a very, very quick way of doing that, and it's quite easy to make a little preset for that. The only thing you have to remember is that you do need, or it's much easier if you have a control layer here with all the controls on it, and then your start and end layers, which just define that. I'm going to do a part 2 of this actually, in which I do scaling, because that was another problem that we had, that everyone wanted their logo the same size perceptually, which means they're not the same width. So we came up with a way of doing that as well, but next time.